good evening. Welcome from Berlin. A warm welcome, I would say a very warm welcome here on this evening from Berlin. Welcome to the panel Empowering the Political Abundant, Addressing Inequalities in the 2020s. This will be our main focus for this evening for the next, I would say, like 75 minutes. This is the room we have to discuss a lot of interesting questions, a lot of interesting challenges. We will have a look at the 2020s, how they unfold in front of our eyes, bringing a lot of new questions to us. This is the COVID-19 pandemic, all the effects it had on the economy, also on the job market, affecting a lot of young people especially. And then we have like some old, well-known challenges that are not going away, which is the climate change and also the transformation process it brings to the coal economy, also to the automotive economy. We have a lot of side effects seen here. And also we have the process of digitalization that shapes the lives of people in a new way, in an unknown way. And so we have a set of new challenges that might not be easy for a lot of people, and we have to see, or we will see, how this affects people who already feel politically abundant. The main question we try to find an answer to is how can progressives shape the 2020s? This will be our main focus, and we will come back to this in the end, but I want to welcome our guests also to think about it all the time when they speak about the questions. We will have an international outlook on this question, the progressive answers for the 2020s. I'm very happy that I can introduce my panel. The first one is Hubertus Heil. He's with me in the studio here in Berlin Mitte. Hubertus Heil is from the Social Democratic Party, the SPD here in Germany. He is Minister for Work and Social Security, and he's also one of the patrons here for the Progressive Center. Mr. Heil, welcome to this panel. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's very hot in Berlin, and so
and also
very warm welcome, I understand.
Yeah, and also we have now in Germany, as we run up to the elections, end of September, we have now the 2 last weeks of parliament business, so the days are full because the parliament still needs to decide about a lot of important laws that need to be done. So it's even nicer to have you here this evening.
Thank you very much, it's very kind.
Then I want to give a warm welcome to Nadia Calviño from Spain. She's the second vice president and minister for economy and digitalization. And she's part of a cabinet, I think that's really interesting if you look at Spain, that has 17 ministers and 11 of them are women, which is a record number in Europe. Mrs. Calviño, a warm welcome from Berlin. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And then number 3 is Jamet Singh. He's a lawyer, a human rights activist, and most important, he's the leader of the New Democratic Party from Canada. And the New Democratic Party also belongs to the Social Democratic spectrum. Mr. Singh, it's good to have you here. We will talk about a lot of issues later. And then you will see Thomas Kralinski is with us, with that nice bike in the background that we can see. Thomas Kralinski is one of the co-founders of the Progressive Center. He's also member of the board, and he also served as head of the State Chancellery for Federal Affairs in Brandenburg. The original title is much longer, but I just tried to cap it like this. He worked for the Bundesland of Brandenburg as well. And you will be our scene setter for tonight. You will give us the first 5-6 minutes of an input to set the scene, also to describe the challenges of the transformation process, as you can give us a bit of an input from a new study that you are conducting right now that is trying to have a look at the effects of the transformation process due to climate change. Mr. Kralinski, nice to have you here, and well, we are ready to go for your input.
Okay, let's start it. Thanks for being, to everybody for being on this call. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I think we all share the notion that we are in a very decisive moment of history, at the crossroads in all of our societies, which has to do with the pandemic, but not just. I think the pandemic just highlighted some problems or accelerated some developments we already have or had. The moment, this decisive moment, I think has also to do with the internationalization, digitalization of all our lives and economies, with climate and energy challenges, with the changing demography, and all of this has to do also with what it does with our democratic systems or our democratic institutions. And in this context, if we are at the crossroads of our societies, it's good that we as progressive movements talk about the so-called politically abundant, because it's not only necessary, but not only to talk about middle class, the well-educated and so on and so forth, but also about the so-called political abandoned. Let me start with a little story. I myself come from East Germany. My grandparents lived in a tiny little town where I often have been to. 30 years ago, or just over 30 years ago, in this town there lived about 1,000 people. And the town had a supermarket, a butcher, 2 bakeries, a hairdresser, a bank, a small DIY supermarket. Once a week, you could go to the movies. It had a pub and what you today would call a gelateria, which is just an ice cafe. And it has a post office. 30 years onwards, the town is still there. It's 20 kilometers away from 2 growing and vibrant cities. It only has 700 inhabitants, so a third less. And what has been left in the local community is just one thing. It's the ice cafe. And the problem is it's actually about to close because the guy who runs it is going to retire very soon and nobody wants to take over or work there. I think in this context, it's good to understand, or it is possible to understand, how and why people might feel forgotten. The German government had a commission where I worked on that looked on what was happening in East Germany within the last 30 years since unification. The question was, why did economic success, what we have there, does not lead to an optimistic society? Why does a fifth or even a quarter of the people votes for right-wing populists? Why is trust in democracy and democratic and social economic institutions is substantially less than in West Germany? And the Commission also conducted a study, and the central finding is where the state and public institutions, public infrastructure, in a broader sense, where these institutions and the state are leaving, populists march in. Which this finding fits to 2 studies that the Progressive Center has conducted 4 years ago. The first of the studies, and the second one is still in the field. These 2 studies consist of in-depth interviews with people in abundant areas, in abundant cities, and a couple of learnings also from the studies still in field are already visible and are to be seen. What we find in these interviews, people are very open and truly appreciate the chance to have a conversation about their life and their expectations, which is, it seems very obvious, but it's not for the people. And this has to do with the second finding, a huge lack of trust. People feel very distant from government. They talk about those people up there. People don't feel represented by democratic institutions. They miss the local presence of the democracy or the democratic institutions, and they miss their politicians. We have MPs in this call that probably all the time say, I'm in my constituency. But the problem is the people don't feel it. The third finding is the discrepancy between the biggest problems of the country, which they feel is like migration, the economy, the pandemic, and the personal challenges, which are different, because they care very much about their everyday life. They care about unfair wages, about pensions policy, general infrastructure, in particular in rural areas, demographic change, broadband availability. I'm not sure whether this is a specific German problem, justice and climate and environmental protection, and the fear that they are the losers when governments tackle climate change. They criticize media and politics for not reflecting what they would call their citizens' agenda, the agenda of normal people, which results in a sense of unfairness and disadvantage. And in the end, is leading to the feeling that politics had withdrawn from certain social and geographical areas, and all of this leads to a strong sense of abandonment. And the question is what we do make of it. And I would say first is give people a say. Let us talk about the people and give them the opportunity to talk. Reduce inequality in social terms, but also in economic terms. And reduce inequality in terms of urban and rural areas, rebuild public infrastructure. And in doing all this, I think there is a chance of rebuilding trust in politics and democracy.
Yeah, thank you to Thomas Kalinski. Thanks for your input. I've made a lot of notes, and I think this will give us a good chance to speak about it later and also to discuss your findings. When will the study be published? When can we read it like in full, the transformation study?
In autumn this year.
Autumn this year. So before
I
or
would
after
say
the
October,
election?
something like October.
Oh, so after the election.
After the election, it's a vision statement for a new government.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in Germany, everything now centers around the 26th of September when we have the general election. So everybody who works in politics or who is broadcasting about politics is really having this date in mind as very decisive. Okay, thanks, Thomas, a lot. And well, yeah, good luck with your study. Thanks. So I want to come back to my guests and give you the chance to introduce yourself a bit and also for our guests to get to know you a bit better. So I want to skip a bit the usual statements that you maybe prepared before. Hubertus Heil, I want to ask you two questions. How would you describe the current debate in Germany about inequality and also the feeling of feeling politically abandoned in Germany right now? What are the main points that we can see that shape the debate? And also, who are you? Well, I spoke about you now as the Minister for Work and Social Security, but why did you go into politics and what is like your dream? Why are you doing this like every day? Why do you come to work every day?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the pleasure to take part in this debate with distinguished guest from Spain, from Canada, and my good old friend Thomas Kalinski. To answer your question, I start with the second one. I also come from a tiny little town in northwest Germany, in Lower Saxony. And the idea why I start my engagement as a very young boy in that time in the 80s, 15 years, I come to the youth organization to the Social Democratic Party, the Young Socialists in that time, was question of equality in the access to education. This was the most important question. It's a question of emancipation, of the chances in life. It's about not the wealthiest get the chances, but every talent counts in the society. And this is still a motivation for me to fight against inequality. And it links to the modern thing. The second thing I raised up in this town, it was a steel town. 50,000 inhabitants when I was young. Now I'm 48 and there are 800 workers in this factory. 50,000 inhabitants of my hometown in the north of Germany, 10,000 people working in the steel company, now 800. So the story of my life is the story about structural change. But in the 90s, I moved from West Germany, from this town, to East Germany. After the reunification, I met Thomas Kralinski. We met in Brandenburg later on. And in this 90s, there was not structural change. There had been disruption. And this belongs to our questions coming ahead. The question of inequality is not just a cultural question. A lot of progressives are debating about, I think it's totally right, somewheres and anywheres, and about more identities in one society, more diversity, and that's a good thing. But it's also a material and social question. And the question is there a society? And I think progressives say, yes, there is a society. We are not Maggie Thatcher. But the consequence for the challenges are coming ahead. The decarbonization, the digital change after the corona crisis, and also the demographic change are we ready to deliver as progressives a policy and politics for realistic hope that we can manage this change and give the people perspective? And secondly, this is a current idea, but also for the future, it's the welfare state stupid. I think in this crisis, once again, progressives have to recognize that we have nothing to fear but the fear itself. Social inequality and a society of fear is not good for the economy because we need inclusive growth. It's not good for the question of individual justice and cohesion of a society. It's also a danger for democracy, like Thomas Kralinski impressively told us. So our job is to find a way for a stronger welfare state. And I think one reason why Joe Biden is building a stronger welfare state in the United States of America is one reaction of the previous President Trump, and the question why workers voted for a right-wing president because they felt left behind by progressive Democrats before. And so we have these lessons learned, and we have to build a stronger welfare state and are managing change, the change of the 20s. I think this is our mission.
Yeah, thanks, Hubertus Heil. I want to give the word to Nadia Calvino. I want to give you the opportunity as well. Give us an insight in the current debate in Spain. How do you debate social insecurity, inequality right now in Spain? What do you see? What are the reactions? Is the reactions also to vote for a right-wing populist party, or are the reactions something else? So, well, let us be part of the debate in Spain, and also the question to you, what is your driving force? Why are you coming to office every morning?
Well, of course, I come to office every morning to change the world, and that's what we are devoting our energy to. With a future-oriented agenda, I think to pick on what Hubertus was just saying, I think fear is exactly the opposite of a progressive agenda, a forward-looking agenda. And therefore, we need to provide certainty in a world of increased uncertainty, insecurities, particularly after the pandemic. And as I was listening also to Mr. Kralinski, I was three thoughts came to my mind, which are more looking back to the history of Spain, but that can give us some lessons for the future. My country, since the democracy arrived, is a country that lived through a period of growth, prosperity. Every generation was feeling we were better educated, the jobs were better, the infrastructures were much better. And so there was this hope, going around, and trust that we were on the line to a better future. Now, this dynamic broke with the financial crisis. And even though Spain has had very strong growth for a number of years already, it took us more than 10 years to recover from the financial crisis in terms of the general macroeconomic indicators. But some of the scars had not been healed when the pandemic hit us. We had higher structural unemployment, youth unemployment, growing inequalities, child poverty. So actually, there was a lot of frustration and disappointment in the young when the pandemic hit us. And this brings me to my second thought, which is that actually the pandemic has hit again the hardest women and the young. And therefore, there is a generation which has only lived in a crisis, and they feel that they no longer have trust that they will live better than their parents, and that we're on a positive drive. This is even worse in depopulated areas. By the way, depopulation and aging is a big problem in Spain too. And now we have to add to it not only the short-term impact of the pandemic, but the fact that to respond to the pandemic, we have been forced to issue massive public debt, which could be a burden to future generations and jeopardize their opportunities to make their own choices in the future. And I think this lack of intergenerational fairness is something we have to be very much aware of. And this brings me to my third and final point to respond to your question. Well, actually, this is a very hot debate in Spain right now. There are some parties that are proposing that in order to bring growth back, what we need is just to lower taxes, and that's basically the agenda. Whereas we, the progressives, we have an agenda which is based on the strong investment and reform program, the Spanish recovery plan, the European recovery plan, based on these 4 priorities: green, digital, social and territorial cohesion, and gender equality. And I think that it is imperative, and the key to bringing forward this agenda will be that we manage to land, to make this a reality, go from very abstract and general concepts to the real life of citizens around us. And then they see that the exit to this crisis is very different to the exit to the previous financial crisis. That this time around, there was a European response and there was a national government's response that is clearly oriented towards the priorities for the future. And let me close with a more positive thought. I think this is a massive endeavor, a very difficult challenge. It's going to demand a lot of effort and coordination with the regional governments, with the whole of society, economic and social partners. But I feel that this time around, at least, we do have a plan. We have the financial means to make it real. And I think we do have a very strong determination to land it and to make it real. And therefore, and I close as I started, to change the world for the better.
Yeah, thanks a lot to Madrid. Thanks, Nadia Calvino. And now I want to introduce Jamit Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party from Canada. Please explain a bit to us the debate in Canada. What is your main focus? What are the main challenges that you see in Canada concerning inequalities and also the feeling of people who feel politically abandoned? What do you see there? And also, I've already read it in the papers, I know it, but I think everybody else wants to know it. What is your dream?
For sure. I'll start with my dream. I'm motivated every day. I wake up every day thinking about something my mom taught me as a kid, that we are all one, that we're not just connected, but when we see people suffering, that is us suffering. When we hurt the planet, we're hurting ourselves. But if we help the people around us, we are all going to rise together. And if we protect the planet and fight climate crisis, we're actually protecting ourselves. So that's one thing that drives me. It's a spiritual belief that is very core. And the other big thing that drives me is my dad. When we were growing up, my dad had a lot of success. He was a professional, a psychiatrist, a medically trained doctor, but he also struggled with addiction. My family went through lots of great times, but then we also struggled with lots of financial difficulties. And the only reason my father was able to get better was when he was able to go to a publicly funded rehab center. He was dealing with a terrible addiction that meant he lost his job and was losing his health. And that publicly funded rehab center was what saved his life. And so I really believe in universal public programs, healthcare, things that it shouldn't matter how much money you earn, it shouldn't matter what your status in society is, but everyone should have access to good quality programs that lift each other up. So healthcare and education. And so that's what motivates me, that's what drives me. I always think about my dad and my mom. Those are my drivers. How do I build a better world so no one has to worry about how much money they have in their bank to get the healthcare they need? And the questions that people are asking in this pandemic and in the recovery is where do we go from here? And there is a lot of abandonment. People really feel, like Ms. Calvino was saying, that society or the economy has been rigged against them. Things were getting better and better each year, but now young people see massive student debt. They see it's impossible to find a home to buy. And they see the ultra rich in this pandemic came out of the pandemic richer than before. They increased their wealth. The 44 wealthiest billionaires in Canada increased their net wealth by $78 billion. So there is serious inequality and people are hurting. And so what we're trying to bring forward as a question is, well, who pays for the recovery and who pays for the cost of this pandemic? It should be the ultra rich who have benefited so much, who have been able to use tax loopholes and not pay their fair share. So that's one big question. A social safety net, like Mr. Heil was mentioning, having a better social safety net, one that works. He said it very bluntly, like, is our safety net stupid? Clearly, it's not working. It's not worked because when the worst times happened, the safety net collapsed and we had to fight to bring in better supports for people. So previous governments have designed a system that has been rigged in favor of the ultra rich. We've seen erosion year over year of our social programs and our public infrastructure. So I believe the recovery, the way forward, is one that's focused on people, on workers, and for the people that feel disenfranchised, feel abandoned, similar to what previous speakers mentioned with the states. Donald Trump, a right-wing Republican, was able to gain the votes of people who are poor, who you would think would need progressives to help them, but they felt disenfranchised. We need to make sure when we speak, we connect with people's emotions, their struggles, their pains. I feel like progressive often have the best policies and the best logical argument, but we miss out on having an emotional connection to what people are actually going through. And so that's what I want to do, connect to what people's struggles are, the fact that people can't find housing, they want a good job, they want to build a good life for their kids, but they can't do that. So that's the vision, that's the debate going on right now. Where do we go from here? What's the recovery that we're going to build? And as progressives, it's really honored to share this stage with all of you and this great institute. We are going to bring forward a vision that is for people, for social programs, for universal programs where we can lift each other up so they all rise and we build a better future together.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jamit Singh, to Canada. And I also want to introduce myself just very briefly. My name is Nadine Linden. I work for Deutschlandfunk, which is a national public radio station in Germany. I work in the office that covers all the matters of parliament and also government. And I'm specialized, or since a lot of years, I work on the right-wing party, right-wing populist party AFD, and also the transport sector. So I see a lot of those debates happening there. And I also see, how can I say, the fight for political solutions in the parliament, in the everyday business. I want to come back to one word that you mentioned, Jamit, which is, I think, central to what we are debating here. And I would share your point of view that you say that progressives have like good ideas, good concepts, but they cannot relate, they cannot connect to the emotions of people. I worked a long time in the east of Germany, in Saxony, where they had those huge demonstrations, the Pegida movement. And it was very interesting because you could see a lot of emotions happening there. Well, it was hate, it was fear, but it was also the feeling of, at least someone's talking to me, there is some feeling of attention. And I want to come back to that point. How can we address people on an emotional level without being too simplistic and without being too populistic also on the progressive side? And I think one of the main questions, in my point of view, for the 2020s that are lying in front of us for the next 10 years that are about to come is, how do we tackle the fear that people are feeling that they are losers in climate politics? Because we have this debate in Germany now. Fuel is more expensive since the beginning of this year. It's just, well, you could say it's just a few cents, but the debate that we have on it is huge. And I think it's just a starting point for what is about to come in the next year. So, Jamit, I mean, you brought in the point with the emotions. You have this, you're analyzing it now, but do you have a solution? Do you have a way to find a more emotional approach and also to tackle that fear? Because I think Canada is also facing some serious challenges with the phasing out of coal and the end of the coal industry in your country.
Absolutely. And those are real questions, and there's a big challenges. So I would say there's two things. One emotion that the right wing uses very well is fairness. And I think fairness is something really basic. You know, kids, when they're growing up, they say, oh, that's not fair. They think about fairness. It's very early on in our lives where we think about fairness and we think about the world through that lens. And so what the right is doing is they make the question of fairness and they say, oh, is it fair that new immigrant is taking your job? So they frame that fairness and turn workers against each other, because whether it's a new immigrant or someone who's been in the community for a long time, they're both workers. They're not the elite. They're not the ultra wealthy. They are in a similar struggle. And so really we want to realign the fairness and not have workers fight each other, but say, well, it's not fair that the ultra rich can hide their money in a tax haven. It's not fair that the ultra rich can hide their wealth and profits and not contribute back. Everyday people contribute, but the ultra rich don't. So we can shift that fairness argument and use that emotionally to realign where the problem is. It's not our fellow workers, but it's the ultra rich and the system that's rigged in their favor. That's one. The second piece is, anytime we talk about the climate crisis, we always say that we will never have a future where we are tackling the climate crisis unless workers are at the heart of the plan. And that way workers don't feel like they're being ignored. They have to be at the heart of the plan. And workers know they want a job that's there for the long term. They want to have a predictable job, and jobs that are in sectors which are being phased out or sectors which are less profitable because of the way the world is working. Workers also want to know that there's some security and there's some stability. So we can address that fear by saying we will not abandon workers. They will be at the heart of our plan. And there is opportunity. You know, we can turn the fear into really an opportunity. We can create good opportunities when we are tackling the climate crisis. We need to create more jobs to tackle this crisis. We're going to need to create more jobs to create a more sustainable economy. And to do that, we are going to focus on giving workers a great opportunity to build a good life for them and their families.
Yeah, but Jamit, let me ask you one question. Can you give an example for that opportunities? Because I think now you were describing the aim. But what is your instrument? How are you shaping the way to actually go there?
Well, one example, a concrete example, as you mentioned, we've got a lot of resources in Canada, and there's lots of instability in those resource sectors. But the workers that work in the same oil well, which may not have a job right now because of the instability in global markets, the fact that people are moving towards renewable energy, the same skills for those workers can go to abandoned oil wells that have been abandoned by companies that need to be fixed and remediated for environmental reasons. They can also be converted into geothermal energy. So those same skills for the oil well workers can be transferred into converting those oil wells into, first, environmentally safe, but secondly, create geothermal energy. And so there's ways to take the skills of those workers and say, we're not going to do a far future transition. We're saying tomorrow we can put you to work for good opportunities for long-term jobs.
Okay, thank you. I want to also encourage all those who listen to us at home or in front of their laptops or iPads or whatever, just write us your questions, give us some inputs. There will be the possibility also for Q's and A's in the end, so feel welcome. Hubertus Haili, I think you wanted to reply to Jamit in the point of workers.
Yes, I agree with a lot of things Jamit said and also Nadia, but in fact, first of all, progressive, this was your question, have to have compassion and respect. I think this is very important. If there is no compassion for daily life for people, if we are beyond the minds and the hearts of people, and we are just engineers of power as progressive, we will lose ground, and we lost ground, to be very honest. Secondly, we have to tell the people the truth. We can't protect them from change, but we have to organize security in times of change. And we also have to do both chances and protection in time of rapid change. I will have a concrete idea. What we talked about, digital and ecological transformation of our economy. Germany has 22% of its growth of industrial-based production. And this is very important for us. And it's not easy to change in a rapid, you call it, in rapid times, our economy, but we have to. And the question is, what do we do with the regions? Do we invest in them and in modern technologies? Is there steel production and automotive production in 10, 15 years in my home region, Lower Saxony? The answer is technology. It's a question to invest in renewables and in infrastructures, but it's not easy peasy to deliver this policy, this investment policy, this public investment policy and the private investment on this in this short time, but we have to. Secondly, we have the question of work, of jobs. It's about reskilling and upskilling. It's about not just to have an insurance for unemployment, but an insurance for employment, which give chances to find reskilling and upskilling or learning a new job. Very concrete perspectives for the people. It's lifelong learning. And last but not least, it's a question of respect. It's a question of respect and good wages. This is very important because if we tell workers working in a factory with a good wage, okay, sorry, it's over because there's climate change, there is no production anymore, and there is just a service job for you with bad wages. We will lose ground, and we lost ground. And one example is what Thomas Kralinski told about his hometown in Saxony in the early 90s and the situation of this Gelati town. And this lesson we have to learn, that we have to build a concrete answer for the next 10, 15 years on our agenda to give hope that we can deliver a good change for our country.
Well, but let's come back to this. You said that you already lost ground. I mean, that is true.
Obvious.
We had, well, it's obvious, like in the for the national election, the SPD is around 15%, coming from 20, maybe 16, depending on the institute who is doing the poll. But also we can see it now. We just had the last weekend, we had a regional election in the Bundesland or in the region of Sachsen-Anhalt, Saxony-Anhalt, which contains of 1.8 million people. So it's not huge, but still it was the last indicator before the national election end of September. And for the Social Democrats and also for the left party, it was a disaster.
It was a disaster.
And also for the Greens. So for the whole progressive spectrum, it was a complete disaster. You can't say it without other words. And also one point that was really problematic for the left party and for the Social Democrat party is that the trust that those two parties can rebuild a socially fair society, or the competence, the value for competence in social justice, it was also a disaster. It was 17 out of 100. So I would like to ask you, what is your learning from this? Because I think you have this plan in your mind, focusing on respect, fair wages, chances from new technology, but obviously you can't connect with the voters.
Well, to be very frank, it was a disaster for us. But there are different situations in different regions in German Länder. As I mentioned, I come from Lower Saxony. We won the last election. We won the election in what is the English word for Rheinland-Pfalz? Hamburg, Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. It's not always the same in one country. It's very different. But the big question is, what can we do to find support for our progressive social democratic way? And where is the trust of the people? Well, I think there is one positive thing in this crisis. I think a lot of people learned that welfare state matters. I'll give you an example. We had the short-time work allowance. It saved millions of jobs. And our democratic social welfare state was very rapid in times of trouble. On the other hand, we saw where the problems are. The frontline worker situation, for example. Everyone gave applause to them. The nurses and the bus drivers and people are working in a supermarket. But the question is there just applause, or are there better wages and better perspective for them? And I think we have to be the party to give our country an economic perspective and a very concrete social perspective that are not working poor in our country. The question of respect, a very, I think, impressive ideas for getting back in the lead of a country. Michael Sandel, the famous author in the United States, gave us, that we have to have a concrete answer, and there's a big idea of a society of respect. I think this is the direction we have to go.
Okay, thanks. I want to give the word to Nadia Calvino and also come back to the question, I think, one of the main questions of the 2020 years, the question of climate change, the fight against climate change, and the changes it brings to certain societies. Ms. Calvino, can you give us an insight of how the debate is led in Spain? What are the challenges that you face? What are the instruments that you use to address it? I don't know, does it affect the tourism sector, or is it also the automotive sector that is under pressure? How do you see this? And I would give in one point that Hubertus Heil mentioned, the working poor. Is this one point that is maybe in Spain relevant for young people who work in platform economy or in jobs like Uber, Deliveroo, who have jobs but who don't have social security and who don't have good wages? And how do you tackle this?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I think this discussion is extremely interesting and insightful because the challenges are quite common to all of us, I think. And I will make a wrap-up conclusion on some of the points. But let me say, I was very intrigued by the reference to fairness made before, because I fully agree with the issue of emotions, particularly now that we're coming out of this crisis and people are extremely stressed and tense, and it's been very tough. You know, people have lost their relatives, they have been sick, and we just had an election in Madrid and there was a landslide victory to the right-wing Popular Party, despite the fact that the president of the region had actually had higher death rates and sick rates, no budget approved, not a good management of the crisis and not a good economic management. And the socialist candidate was putting forward a responsible government that would have a good management and, a serious sort of campaign. And people voted for the other candidate because she had this word, freedom. So this was what mobilized everybody. Freedom to go out, freedom to go to the bars, freedom not to pay taxes, freedom. People have been in their houses secluded for a year, and the word freedom was the one that brought them out, to vote massively. And so I think that this is an important point. I'll come back to this in a second. Secondly, climate change is one area, one policy where there is this intertemporal conflict. There is a trade-off. This is very good for the future, but it may have a negative impact in the short run. And indeed, we have had exactly the same sort of challenges, and we are having the same sort of challenges. Car manufacturing, Germany is the first car manufacturer in Europe. Spain is the second. We are the second car exporter in Europe. And therefore, we absolutely need to foster and support the transition to the electric car. And so this was the first strategic plan, program or projects that we have announced. The King of Spain, the President Sanchez, they announced the first strategic project we want to fund with the European Recovery Plan is the transition to the electric car. This is very challenging. It means bringing together lots of public and private players throughout the whole value chain. But we are very clear that this has to be a top priority, and we want to succeed and continue to be one of the leading car manufacturers in Europe. And for the coal mines, we have been at the forefront in closing them for some years. We have done it after a negotiation with the unions, so it has been a well-managed process. Coal-fired plants have decided to close faster than we had anticipated due to the price of CO2. And so we are now facing the challenge of investing in those regions which have been, losing economic opportunities. We just issued last week a public invitation for projects to be presented in order to avoid that these regions feel left behind, and abandoned, to use the expression used before. To us, the recovery plan is absolutely instrumental, because that can provide us with the resources to undertake the necessary investment to make digitalization and the green transition a success. And, this is obviously what we need to do in the middle to long run. This is going to be a success, but we need to make sure that it is also a success in the short run. This is why, by the way, social and territorial cohesion is the third top priority in our plan. As I mentioned before, green, digital, social and territorial cohesion, and gender equality. But the debate this week, actually, which I think is very similar to the one in Germany, is due to the CO2 price, which has gone up above $50 per ton, much faster, much earlier than anyone could have anticipated, is the whole debate on energy prices. Because it coincided in Spain with a new tariff system that is aiming to have a more efficient use of energy at home. So everybody's discussing the right time to put the washing machine on, and how to make a more efficient use of air conditioning. Also, the heat wave has come just now. So I think this is the perfect example of how the progressives, we need to provide, on top of an attractive agenda, we need to respond to the citizens' needs, priorities, and concerns. And this is I think, the top challenge we have. This is my final remark. Yes, for Spain, the working poor, as I was saying before, has been the new reality after the financial crisis. And this has been dragging our economy for more than a decade now. And so we need absolutely to make the green and digital transition a success, so that good jobs, performance, and productivity increases, that we invest in human capital, and we are sure that the salaries will be appropriate for citizens, for persons to lead a life, particularly for the young. And so the recovery plan is covering this this is our top priority. But even if we have a perfect plan, and even if we have a perfect agenda, I think that the main challenge, and this comes back to Huberto's point and also to my initial remark, is that the reality is very complex. And the responses to the challenges are very complex too. And there is now the rhythm of communication and the way messages come to citizens is so fast that it is very important to capture these in simple terms and simple feelings. The same way the word freedom was key or instrumental to visualize what the economic program was. I think that we absolutely need to find those words that synthesize our vision for the future. And fairness is, of course, one of the traditional ones, representing the progressive agenda. But maybe we have to be a bit more creative to find these words that will try to synthesize the complexity around us and these ambitious and difficult agendas, if we want to really get to the hearts and to the minds of the people.
One more question. Well, you said that people are discussing about the energy prices right now because Spain has a more or less similar debate to Germany. But my question is, what do you say people who address their fears and also their economic concerns, speaking about energy prices going up? because I think the problem is for a lot of people, energy prices are a very concrete, a very everyday, a very down-to-earth worry, because you just have the income that you have. And the use or the welfare of the climate might be a very abstract aim that is not so easy to handle, and that might not be so, how can I say, might not be so popular. What is your answer, Ms. Calvino?
Well, we're working very hard to accelerate the transition towards a higher share of renewables. Actually, last year we saw a very, very low energy price with a very large share of our energy being produced through wind and solar. And so that gives, I think, a view that if we manage to accelerate the process, we can move to a lower cost of energy and a lower price of energy. The second thing that we are doing is sharing the burden. We have just published a consultation on how to reduce the windfall profits that were coming to some sources of generation due to the regulation of our energy markets, so that it is not only the taxpayer or the citizen that has to undertake the increase in the cost. I think that burden sharing is definitely something which is very important. This is very similar to what the Canadian colleague was saying about paying taxes, and bearing the burden of this increased cost of public services. But in the short run, the difficulty is that CO2 price hike has coincided with the new tariff system, and also with as I was saying, the higher temperatures, which in Spain is a major issue for air conditioning. But we are actually undertaking a number of measures which are all going in the direction of reducing energy prices. And so I hope that these measures will have an impact soon, so that we sort of turn the tide or change this dynamic, and we can go back to the low prices that we were having until just some weeks ago.
Thank you. Hubertus, before I bring you back to the discussion, I have one very short question to Jamit. We spoke about claims for progressives to tackle or to find a new narrative or a new claim for the 2020s. Now, Nadia Calvino suggested the word fairness. What would be your word for a new progressive narrative for the 2020s? Do you have something in mind already?
Yeah, fairness is actually what we really are working on. Fairness. I really liked the comment by Mr. Heil around respect. We talk a lot about respect and dignity, the respect that people deserve, the dignity that workers deserve, fairness for workers, and how it's unfair that the ultra-rich are not paying their fair share. So fairness is really one of the biggest ones that we're working on. It's an emotional connection. Justice as well, but it's a little bit loftier. It doesn't really hit people where they are in a concrete way. So fairness is one. And building a good life. We want people to be able to build a good life for themselves and their family. So those are some of the themes that we want to touch on, really speaking to people where they are and the struggles that they're going through.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks, Jimmy. So we have the word respect, we have the word fairness as suggestions. Hubertus Heil, I want to give one question to you that comes from the chat, and I think it's really interesting because it focuses a bit more on the demographic situation. And it's Matthias Pfisterer. He wants to know whether there isn't a problem or the opportunity that we lose young people in the discussion about the welfare state. You said, it's a welfare state, stupid, because we pay a lot of pensions to people who are already old, to people who are middle-aged, who already have their share. And I think he wants to express his fear that the young generation will be faced with a world of climate challenges, but also of pension challenges, because the pension funds are empty. The demographic situation is as it is. There are young people lacking. What is your questions to that, so that we don't how can I say, ignore the fears of people who are 17, 18, 20, maybe just started to work. And also, Jamit, I've read in the papers that you also spoke a lot, or that you thought about, a lot about migration and fairness, how you can frame it. So maybe we can combine these 2 points.
Okay, it belong together, to be very clear. The transition of the labor market, Nadia mentioned the question how we invest in technologies, in the future of work, in the regions in transition times, in the digital and green transition, is the most important question for the stability of the social welfare systems. It's not this easy talking about our pension systems. We can't found them in the future because of the older one. And there is a demographic challenge in Germany. And the challenge is, in the times of 2025 until 2040, the baby boomers will get in the pension system. But if there is a chance to have younger people in the labor market with fair wages, it's the best we can do for the stability of the pension systems. The answer is not to privatize our pension system, but to strengthen it with more people paying into the system, with good wages, with a higher employment rate by men and women, with working conditions which allow it to work longer, with reskilling and upskilling. I think in the debate about the solidarity and the justice between the generations, we have to be very frank that people who are talking about raising the age for pensionists, this is the current debate from a more liberal, neoliberal side in Germany, is not a threat for the older ones. It's a threat for the younger ones, because they are talking about the younger people. If you start in a job with 17 and you have to work 51 years, it's a problem for them. And so I think it's a big challenge, a demographic challenge, but we can answer them in the times between 2025 and 2024 if there are a lot of people in jobs. And I'll give you an optimistic example why this is my opinion. 10 years ago, there was a very negative perspective for the German labor market. They talked about 36 million employers in Germany. Now we are 40 million, and this makes a big difference for the social security systems we have in Germany. So we not just have to talk about reforms in the pension systems, but we have to talk about taking part in the labor market for the younger ones and for the middle-aged, to have a stable pension system. This is one answer, and it's a very big question for a lot of people. Pension is not for pensionists, but if you see the polls and asking younger people, they are worrying if there is a pension system for them. And we have to give them a perspective also, especially the self-employed people who are not really secured in our system for life risk. This is one Corona example. We had the self-employed people in Germany talking about the health insurance. There was no short-term work scheme, the German Kurzarbeit for them, because they are not in the system, and also the question of their security when they are older. These are, I think, alternatives to the policy which neoliberals are promising, namely cutting the welfare state.
Jamit, how do you see that question of also the generational justice? We had that one question from the chat from a young person who was asking, well, how do you address the fears of young people of more or less losing their pensions and not having a future in the pension system? And how can we shape also a fair debate on migration? What would you share with us from Canada in that point? Oh, I think we can't hear. I think you're still on mute.
Yes, sorry. There was some background noise I didn't want.
Ah,
So,
Fine.
young people are afraid, and as was previously mentioned by Ms. Calvino, it's because for the first time ever, young people are looking at less prosperity, less quality of life than their previous generation, than their parents. This is one of the first times this happening in Canada. I know it's happening in Europe. So young people are afraid. So one of the things we have to point out is that the reason they're afraid is, first of all, it's real. They have a genuine fear because things are getting worse for them. It's higher debt, harder to purchase a home, harder to find a job. The job you get may not be a long-lasting, stable job like it was for our parents' generation. So there's a lot of legitimate fears. I think one, we've got to acknowledge that and hear people out. The second thing is a lot of that is because of a system that is rigged that way. It is rigged that some of our most important workers that we cheered them in Canada as well. The frontline workers at grocery stores, our bus drivers, our transit workers, the people on the front lines, we cheered them, but they still get paid some of the lowest wages, especially the service workers at the grocery stores. So we need to make sure that workers have a bright future with good salaries, that young people have good salaries and good wages. And to tackle the question of migration in Canada, we've seen that it is a strength. When we bring in immigration, it is something that is seen as an economic driver. People come into communities. Even international students make up a significant population of the migration. They come to communities and contribute. They work in those communities, particularly in more rural communities where there are less workers sometimes because people move out of those communities and there's an aging population. Young, new Canadians, new immigrants come in and provide more opportunities for work. They're able to give a boost to the economy. So we've shown with lots of clear evidence that it is actually good for Canadians. It is good for our society to have immigration. It has been a contribution and a benefit. And so we've talked about that. And I think that we've gotten to a good spot where people really are seeing that benefit in their communities.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I want to ask a question also to Ms. Calvino from Spain, and I want to ask you as well, one point that I have on my list like for the whole evening. What is the role of women in the narrative of progressives to tackle the challenges of the coming years, of the 2020s? Is there a special, how would I say, female answer, female narrative that you can provide? And what are your experiences as the second vice president and the minister of finance of Spain? What is your contribution to that?
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that question because indeed Spain is a country, we have 4 vice presidents and we're all women. So when President Sanchez is surrounded by us, I think the picture is quite impressive, actually. And I think this is a very strong symbol of the long road that we have traveled since democracy came to Spain. And women's participation in the labor market, in the political life, in leadership in companies, etc., has been one of the drivers for change in Spain for the last 40 years. And I am convinced that this is also going to be one of the drivers for change going forward. And that is why gender equality is the 4th axis of our recovery plan. Because if we manage to mobilize women and close the gender gap, GDP can grow by more than 15%. It is not only a matter of a fair society, it's economically sound, that we use the talent of 100% of our society. The Spanish society is actually quite feminist, quite egalitarian. More than 90% of population think that women should have the same participation. So in that sense, we are in a positive environment. But I absolutely think that it is the female skills that are also going to be key in this new phase going forward. Not to say that our male colleagues don't have those skills. Don't get me wrong, and I am, I'm absolutely convinced that Yamit and Hubertus have the necessary skills. But I think, working together, we can make a much a better, I think, contribution at reaching the hearts of the people. And this brings me to my the reflection I was having when you were mentioning the words, that can drive us forward. I actually was thinking the three words I use in all my public statements, and more I have just realized more and more these are the three words I always use, and I think it is because I am responding to the to what people are feeling right now, and people feel that they are in a crisis, that there's a lot of uncertainty, and that there's fear. And as I said before, fear is the opposite to a progressive agenda. And so the words I use the most are stability, confidence, and hope. And I think hope is probably the one that actually has this forward looking vision that we will be able to go back to the road of prosperity and welfare and dignity that we were on before the financial crisis hit us. We will go back to that, and that in order that word confidence and hope, which in Spanish is esperanza y confianza, are two words I use in all my public statements, or almost all. And I just realized, so those are probably the two words that to me symbolize what a progressive agenda means nowadays.
Okay, thanks. I want to, well, I had a look at the watch and I think we are almost at the end of our panel, but I want to come back to the central question, or to the main question that we were focusing on right now, is how can progressives shape the 2020s? This was like our starting point, it was the angle that we were talking about. Now, from what you've heard, what would you tell all those people who listen to us right now, who work, well, who maybe are young, who work in parties, who work in NGOs, or who work in other jobs, maybe who work in the industry, wherever? What would you tell them how they can shape the 2020s in a progressive way? What is your main point? Maybe, well, let's make it short. Let's focus on 1 minute.
Well, as Nadia said, our words are similar and our mission is the same. It's about hope, or in Germany in our campaign we call it future. It's about respect, and it's about Europe. And the good news is that we work together with progressives to find common answers on a global and a European level, fighting against climate change. Because reacting on crisis, more resilient economies, finding a European framework for minimum wages and collective bargaining. Our Spanish and German comrades, we are aligned on that question. And this is a different, after the crisis 10 years ago. It was a neoliberal answer, it was austerity. This is a future by investment. And I think this is a path we have to go in the 20s. Last but not least, to give our society chances and protection through this time of rapid change. This is a mission, and it's also the mission to build social progress out of technical innovation. I think this is the path we have to go.
Great. Thanks. Jamid, what is your message to young people who want to shape the 2020s in a progressive way?
Well, I think young people have incredible power. I was first elected because of an incredible team of volunteers. I was 32 when I first was elected. My entire team was younger than that, and my volunteer base were under 18. They couldn't even vote, but they were so mobilized. They were able to make this big change. And for the first time, a social democrat was able to win in a region that had never voted social democrat. So I believe in the power of young people. I would say the past number of years have been about a focus on industry, hoping that helps workers and people, a focus on corporate and corporations that continued to gain wealth, hoping that that would help workers and people. And now I think the 2020s has to be a time where we actually go directly to people. We focus on people and workers, and we build an economy around them instead of the other way around. Build it around an industry, hoping that it helps the worker, or build it around the corporation, hoping it helps the worker. Those models have failed. We've got to build a future around young people, around workers, around people. And then that type of economy will actually be good for the planet and will be good for all of us.
Yeah, thanks. Nadia, what is your message?
Yes, my message is that the exit to this crisis will be very different to the previous one. It will be faster. It will lead to significant change in our in the way we grow and the world we are building. And the recovery plans that we're going to be putting in place are future-oriented and trying to provide more opportunities precisely to the young generations. And let me say a final word, just to pay tribute to Olaf Scholz, because I absolutely think that without him being the leader in the financial ministry in Germany, we wouldn't have been able to craft this exit to the crisis, this very different exit to the crisis as compared to the previous one. He has been instrumental to lead the response since last spring, to shape the recovery plans, and to make sure that we have a progressive agenda that can give hope and confidence to citizens throughout the EU.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks for that panel with the question of how progressives can shape the 2020s. The years to come, we will see, I think we will have a lot of debates around justice, around climate change, around the whole point of climate politics. I want to say thank you a lot to Huberto Sayer, Nadia Calvino and Jamet Singh. And I want to also say thank you to the whole team of the Progressive Center for making it possible, the whole meeting and the whole panel. And I hope that you had a great day today with the other panels and that you will have a very interesting day also tomorrow. So thanks from here, thanks from Berlin, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much for the moderator.
Thank you all. Bye.
And next year physically without digital.